back in the olden days, when I was director of the American National Election Studies, I learned just how hard it was to run a high-quality survey study, scholarly. Scholarly surveys, by the way, if you don't know, have nothing to do with public opinion polls. It's not just because doing a good survey was really harder than a lot of people realize. It was also hard because of the special attributes of a major benchmark scholarly national election survey. They must respond to and anticipate the underlying scholarly concerns that are currently important, but they also are a time series. That is, they have to link to all of the previous studies that have been done, and balancing those two concerns is really difficult. The design and execution of the methods you use to design the surveys, put them in the field, check the data quality, collect the data, check the quality, transform the raw data into usable data, check the quality, and execute the appropriate ways to share the data can cause many, many headaches. But also, national election studies often are not just surveys, they involve collections of associated data. And because these data are designed to be widely and publicly available, the leaders of these studies are at all times subject to the concerns of a widely divergent constituency of scholars. You have to involve them in the process, and you're always working to keep the public funding on which this all works going. But I did the work in the olden days. For a variety of reasons, I can't even imagine what it's like to do this work today. But that's only part of what Jane Green does as co-director of the British Election Study, which has been running for about 60 years now. Jane Green is professor of political science and British politics at Nuffield College, University of Oxford, where she's director of the Nuffield Politics Research Centre. Since 2013, she has been co-director of the British Election Study, publishing papers using new survey items in the study with a particular focus on economics, wealth, economic security, and latterly, Brexit, one of all of our favorite subjects. She is co-author of the Oxford University Press published British Election Study book, Electoral Shocks, and of the forthcoming book, Electoral Realignment, and also The Politics of Competence, authored with Will Jennings in 2017, published by Cambridge University Press. Alongside the British Election Study, she recently fielded a new survey on intergenerational attitudes in 2018, and is now in the field with a new three-wave panel study focusing on economic insecurity and political outcomes. As most of you know, the UK is in the throes of a major shift in partisan preferences as they await a new general election sometime this year. Jane will take an active role in analyzing the election for ITV News, as she did in 2015, 2016, 2017, and 2019. She's also interested in U.S. elections, and of course, we are providing her with some entertainment in that regard as well. I was thrilled this past year when she was elected to become an honorary international member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, founded in 1780 by the likes of John Adams, Sam Adams, James Bowdoin, John Hancock, to bring together leading figures dedicated to gathering knowledge and advancing knowledge in service of the public good. I didn't ask you before whether anybody shared the handshake of the club, but at dinner.
Oh,
we can do
okay.
So I'm more than pleased to introduce Jane Green, who will talk with us about family matters, how family concerns relate to policy preferences and political choices. Take it away.
Thank you, Gina. That's the most beautiful summary of what it feels like to be involved in a major election study. That really is very sweet. Right now, we're fielding 3 new surveys. That's pretty much all I've done for the last 2 months is design survey questions and battle with negotiations between collaborators to get the content right. So it's really sweet of you to describe it all like that. Thank you. So we're an intimate group, so I just want to talk to you in that kind of way. And I think we're going to have the pleasure of meeting tomorrow as well. Good. So please do ask questions as I go through. Just let's keep this really informal. We can have a chat. And thank you for coming and to listening to this. I'm really looking forward to what you think and what your questions might be. I'm going to present two projects, two papers from one project. The reason this project came about, it was very much kind of inspired by thinking, how much of the way we think about survey items and surveys and questions and concepts in political behaviour feels to me that it comes from a kind of a long tradition where rational choice theorization had dominated the discipline, right? That the idea that we're all rational self-maximizers, we're quite self-interested. And, there's lots that I could say about that. I think lots of the economic voting literature also has taken its heritage from quite a neoliberal economics tradition. And this is imbued in our politics, right? Our politics is very cynical. And, if you watch anything in UK politics, you'll be forgiven for thinking that all a political party has to do is appeal to people's self-interest, and they'll just essentially roll over their values or their principles about other sets of issues or other concerns because they'll just do what's right for them. And so we have debates at the moment about, the Conservative, and please, in the Q&A, you can ask me anything about British politics. It's so fun. But we have a Conservative government right now that essentially is thinking, as long as we give people some tax giveaways, they're going to kind of forget about the last 10 years and the state of the country, right? And it's just crazy. So this project came about by thinking about how do people think about others that they care about? And how does thinking about others that you care about motivate your political preferences, your demand for different policies, and also how you might vote in an election? And the other kind of, there are two motivations, and on a personal level for me, I always like to kind of tell stories a little bit. I think it's much more relatable. And, because what we're really doing is understanding human life, right? We're just understanding people. So one of the motivations for this for me was having a child and realizing just how much of a financial set of commitments we make once we have children, not just to feed them and clothe them, but to provide the nice home, to try to think about their future, to think about your savings and what you have in your life that you might be able to then provide as security and as a comfort and as a contribution to their lives. And it was funny when I had my son, this is quite a long time, that was 12 years ago now, 11 years ago, sorry. All of the mums in my kind of group, my antenatal group, we were all doing the same thing, right? Almost everyone bought a new house. And it wasn't just because we wanted the extra space. There was something about wanting to provide the right environment, that the best that you could. And so this kind of sense that we've had in Britain as well, and I know it's partly true in the US too, that one of the reasons this has become so interesting as well is because of intergenerational inequalities, right? We're worried now about younger generations being able to get onto the housing ladder. And we're also, in the flip side of that, we're worrying now about an aging population and having to, care for others, older members of the family. So this was the kind of one context is like, oh my gosh, how are people navigating this? These difficult decisions that, you're stretched on potentially both sides. You want to provide for this younger generation, you're worried about them, you're worried about this group. Does it matter to people? Do people think about others? And then the other motivation was the Brexit vote. So I understand that's been a topic of close interest. But there was a huge kind of debate then about, why all these grandparents voting against the interests of younger generations? Why was it that older people essentially were saying, I don't care about your future, I'm just going to vote on the basis of what I think? And it seemed to me so incongruous to think that, surely one reason you can reconcile this is that people genuinely thought this was better for themselves and for younger generations. They just had different views of what was going to be beneficial. Anyway, so here we are. So here we have a new survey, which we ran in 2022. And what we did was focus, for the first time, we think, on questions about family members. And I'm going to show you two kind of insights that we've gained from this. And I hope that you'll find it useful, interesting, and hope that you'll ask questions, because these papers are they're either in the kind of it's just been rejected from X journal and we need to go send it somewhere else, or we're just in the drafting stage of another one. So Okay, so as I said, what we've got is this kind of interesting context, right, where we've got big intergenerational divides, and there's lots of reasons for this, but one of the key ones is homes are unaffordable for younger generations, but they were very affordable for older generations. Older generations have seen huge asset appreciation over time. And there's other changes in like that. We've had booms in social mobility for older generations when they were in work and so on. And we've had very generous pension provisions. So we have essentially very secure older generations. You can debate about how they've responded to the cost of living crisis, given that their incomes are very static. But anyway, but we also have an older and because of that less healthy older population. And we've also, within that context, age has become the defining feature of political choice. And that's also not just unique to the UK, right? We see big age divides in how people are voting now, and big age divides and big educational divides as well. And those are actually a whole other piece of work I've done looking at the kind of interrelationships of those two things. And so what we have is big divides on so-called socio-cultural issues. So issues such as immigration is the classic one, but it's obviously Brexit in the UK. And I'm going to show you now that we've got greater consensus on economics. And we kind of wondered, like, well, one of the reasons this is so important is there's talk about a gerontocracy, right? That older voters are essentially deciding the outcome of elections because they vote in higher numbers and they happen to also vote for our Conservative government at the time. So this is our kind of context. And this is just some evidence to illustrate what I've just been saying. So on the left-hand side, we've got the age divide on how you'd vote in a Brexit referendum, which is essentially this very, very steep gradient. So you've got 18 to 80-year-olds and their likelihood of voting for Brexit, and just the confidence intervals is why those are shaded in grey. So this is just a very stark age divide. On the two right-hand side graphs, what you have there is support for policies that benefit older voters and measured in 4 different ways. And so on the middle graph, you've got 3 different ways of looking at preferences towards more spending on social care, which for us is like elderly care in homes, and also going into people's homes and providing help in the home. Support for mobility is a kind of a funny question we asked about, like how could you help older people stay healthy, more funding for this, and support for pensions. And so you still see the age gradient, but it's not as steep. It's steeper for pensions, which is the darker line in the middle graph. But the key thing there is that majorities, almost everybody, no matter what your age, wants to give greater support to older populations, right? You've got above 50% who want to give greater support, and you've got much less of an age gradient. So that's interesting. And then the other one is whether you would prioritise spending on the old or spending on the young. And again, you see, yes, there's a gradient. It's not as steep, but it's also the majorities really want to support spending on elders. So this is a kind of interesting puzzle for us. And it's one of the ways we thought, well, I wonder to what degree can we see that there might be kind of greater concern across the age distribution, that there might be a source of building greater consensus rather than this kind of, well, old people just want this and young people just want this, and we'll trade off these kinds of 2 groups against each other, and one party will just represent these people and one party the other. So the argument is that people care about their family members. It just feels so obvious to me. Sometimes when you do research, when you've thought about something, it's like, well, yeah, like, of course. But it's surprisingly absent in the literature, and it's not completely absent. Like there are papers that tangentially look at one aspect or another, or look at partners. Or there's an interesting paper that says fathers that have daughters tend to have more pro-feminist views. There are papers that are looking at some of these issues, but nothing that's really dug into the kind of broad set of evaluations and preferences. So, if family matters, it's sort of worth breaking down, well, what are we saying in the context of? Well, obviously, if you're forming preferences about policy, then of course your own experience is really important, the national news, all of your values, your ideology, your partisanship, and so on. But particularly the experiences of those groups to which you identify. And so if we think about what's your in-group, what's the group that's most important to you, that you identify most with, that you share the most with, then arguably the family is the kind of definitional in-group. It's like the group, I mean, we might not all love all the members of our family, and let's just put that to one side. Right, families aren't perfect, but you know more about your family members. You're aware of their circumstances. You probably care about it. You probably, get updates on a regular basis, and you're informed about your family. And so there are two key ways that we're arguing this could really matter. One is that obviously you have emotional bonds. Again, this just feels so obvious to say it. But the other is that you have linked fates. So, if your family members are struggling, then that's actually going to impact on your own financial well-being as well, right? So this isn't just a sort of altruistic argument. This is also an argument that says, if I'm hitting 50 this year, which is slightly terrifying. But if I'm a 50-year-old person and my kid is not doing, can't get on the housing ladder, then that's going to really impact on my financial well-being as well, right? And it's also going to impact perhaps or even on my sense of success, like have I done the right things, all the rest of it. So in a sense, there's kind of not self-interested, but there's just a bucket of reasons you think that these kinds of ties would be really important. But if you think about what survey research has done, and of course I'm talking to a group of people, I don't know what your backgrounds are, so please forgive me if you know everything about surveys or you're just new to surveys, I've got no idea. But fascinatingly, and Gina talked about the American National Election Study, I looked back at some of the older surveys and they did ask about the family household, not just the household. And I thought, but that hasn't happened since the 1970s or 80s. And what's fascinating here is that the meaning of the household has changed over time, hasn't it? So you can imagine when you first started asking about the unit of the family, it made sense that the family unit was the household unit. Now we ask about household finances and household well-being and household income and household gross net, all the rest of it. But actually the household can mean loads of different things now. And it doesn't necessarily mean the family, and it doesn't necessarily mean the children within the household doesn't necessarily even mean children, as in child children. It could mean adult children, right? Because adult children can't leave home because they can't afford to. So it's really interesting that this kind of focus on individuals, households, sometimes children, sometimes partners, but really it's the individual. We think about the individual and the national economy and everything else. But then the family does pertain to households, of course it does, but only specifically family households, not households of students living under one roof or graduate professionals who can't afford to buy their own homes, sharing houses, right, which I did for years and years and years. Family also pertains to households with or without adult dependents. So if we think that's, increasingly you've got adult children living in your household or elderly living in your household. And then, of course, there's the family outside the household. So if we think we're asking about the household, we're asking about the individual, what about your adult children who are out in the world, at university or whatever they're doing, getting a job? How do your evaluations matter? And the thing is that these can all be a source of emotional bonds and linked fates, right? That's the whole point. And so, it's important to think about how we survey these questions. So what do we think's going on here? Well, we make two arguments, essentially, in these two separate little papers. Well, one's a big paper, chunky paper, very long paper, and one's currently a short paper. So the first is that essentially what you should want to see government do more for younger generations if people within your family who are younger are struggling financially, right? Again, just seems so obvious to me, and it seems so straightforward. The other argument relates to the other end of the scale. So whether or not you think that you may have to provide for older members of your family. And I'll go into I'll just summarize briefly some of the literature that exists around kind of that generosity towards older generations. You saw the generosity towards older generations in those graphs, right? It's one of the really fascinating things that we seem to be very generous towards spending on older populations, members of the population. But these are our two key sets of expectations. Those are our two key sets of thoughts that I'm going to walk you through. So this is just a kind of outline of what we did. We did this online with YouGov. It has about 6,000 people. And we really dug into these preferences, but we also really dug into the family and to evaluations of how family were doing. And this is the question I'm going to be focusing on that we used. for the first part. Thinking about your own close family, how well are family members in the following age groups doing financially on average? So we just borrowed the question that we would normally ask about financial well-being. We also asked a question, during the next 10 years or so, how likely or unlikely is it that you will need to give significant financial or practical assistance to a close family member in their 60s, 70s and over with care or housing needs? So care or housing there is combined for lots of reasons. So we're going to use those two items to see whether or not this predicts preferences towards old and young, depending on if you agree with these statements or if you have family members in the following age groups. And I'll first of all take you through the first thing, which is concerns for the younger generation, then I'm going to focus on concerns for the older. So what is the evidence that people even perceive these inequalities? I mean, I'm calling them inequalities. I think that's fine. So here what we have is age of the respondent on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, the percent who have relatives who are doing badly or financially. And what you see there, the red line is younger relatives, so 18s to 39s. So these are adults, young adults. And yes, there are large proportions, especially around the kind of, this is just over the people who are over 40. You have large proportions, especially around the kind of mid-50s to 60s, who have younger relatives doing badly financially. And it tails off as people get older. And then you see the middle line have those in their 40s, between 40 to 59, and then the light grey line is who have relatives age 60 plus doing badly financially. So there's a lot of awareness, essentially, that younger people are struggling. And that's true across the age distribution, but it's particularly true for those people who are in that part of their lives where they've got kids who are adults, essentially. And one of the things we wanted to do, sorry, I should have introduced this before flipping to it, but one of the things we wanted to do was understand if it was real. So are these evaluations grounded in reality? And so here what we're doing is we're saying, well, are those perceptions predicted by whether the eldest child, we'd only ask about the eldest child for these detailed questions. Do they own their own home, and do they have a college degree? And those are the two things that predict whether or not you think your younger family member is struggling financially, right? So this is, and there's all the controls are listed on the right-hand side. So this is just adults over 40. And the coefficient plot here is significant if it's not crossing zero, and then the multiple lines are just models with or without lots of different controls added. So essentially what we're showing you there is it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you control for the well-being of the individual, the financial well-being of the individual. That's not predicting your evaluations of your younger family member. It's the younger family member's home ownership and whether they have a degree. And the degree thing's super interesting for a ton of reasons, because people think that graduates are having a hard time. Actually, graduates, relatively speaking, are having a great time. It's the non-graduates who are younger that are really struggling the most. And one of the reasons having a degree is so important is it might not mean you're financially affluent in the short run, but it means that your prospects and your aspirations are much better, and your future security is much more guaranteed, at least in people's minds. So these perceptions are rooted in some, in sort of hard realities. Okay, so the way we were looking at the kind of dependent variable here is, do these people that have younger family members who are struggling financially, are they more likely to support pro-young policies? So the pro-young policies here are, would you support or oppose increased government spending on the following, even if it leads to increasing taxation or reduction in spending elsewhere? So we're trying to make it as real as possible. So we have increasing the amount on affordable housing, council housing. That's an interesting distinction in the UK, incidentally, but I won't go into the details now. We thought older people might be more pro-council housing because they might have benefited from it themselves. This is essentially housing provided by local authorities. Increased free vocational or technical education, free education for university students, and free childcare. So we're combining all of these items because essentially they all correlate really strongly. And so we're interested in, okay, so you're an adult over 40, you have a younger member of the family financially struggling, are you more likely to support these policies? And the answer is yes. So this is just looking at the over 60s group, which also was, we were interested in different kind of cuts here. But the red bar essentially shows you that, this is literally just descriptive data here. This is the percent in each group. If you say yes, you have younger family members who are financially struggling, you're more likely to support each of these policies, and that's in comparison to all others, all aged over 60. And then with a model, looking at whether or not this is significant in a model, we find yes. So again, we have these plots with the different additions of control variables, which makes absolutely no difference, really. So if you have relatives who are doing badly financially, you're much likely to support all of those policy proposals than if you're not in that group, if you have relatives who are doing neither badly or well, or if you don't have relatives at all. And so young adult orientated policies is that very strange acronym, which you can't pronounce. So this was evidence that indeed, it does look like people have other oriented preferences. But we're also interested in, well, okay, do people do anything about it? It's all very well to say, yes, I would like lots of nice things, please. So we've asked about preferences on these questions, those 5 questions that I listed. We also asked people to trade off. So would you support spending on younger people versus your own spending on your own age group? And this is what we found with prioritization questions. So we were literally saying on a scale, I haven't put the questions here, but on a scale here, you would either prioritize this or you had to trade off with other policies aimed at the older population. And again, we see that those same over 60s with financially struggling younger relatives were more likely to prioritise more affordable housing, or at least one policy aimed at young adults. And so people were trading off. They were saying, yes, I want less spending on my age group and I want more spending on this age group, which we thought was interesting. And we're also interested in if people would vote on this basis, right? Again, it's all very well to answer in a survey that you're going to be very nice and support these young adults. Do people actually sort of back this up with their vote intention? And so these, again, are just the descriptive statistics here. And it's important to remember in the UK that there's this huge age gradient in Brexit support, but there's this huge age gradient in support for the Conservatives versus the Labour Party, right? The gradient hasn't changed, just the point at which you become a Conservative has got older and older and older over the last year. So now I think the Conservatives are only slightly ahead now amongst the over 65s. They're starting to get really terrified now, actually. Today's polling, I was on Twitter in the early hours with my jet lag head, looking at all of these new polls that were coming out today, and it's looking really quite bad for them. Anyway, so what you've got there is you've got the likelihood of, or the vote intention for the Conservatives in blue for all people aged 60 plus. This was in August 2022. And you see that big age gap there you see the gap between Labour and Conservatives there. And essentially with those adults who are aged 60 and over with younger relatives struggling, the gap between the Conservatives and Labour disappears. So you don't see the Conservatives ahead, you don't see them very much behind, you see them level pegging. So that big gap that otherwise defines this older group has gone away. And again, in a multivariate model, we find that indeed holds up with tons of control variables added. And I haven't listed the control variables, but some of these are really important. They're all really important, but some of these are, quite crucial to seeing whether or not there's a distinct effect of thinking specifically this group is struggling financially, or whether you just think the national economy is going badly. Are these evaluations of younger generations just standing in for the state of the country more broadly? The other thing that we've done with this model is we had a question asking, I'm sorry, the title of this one is slightly, the top title's fine. It should say predictors of voting for the Conservatives versus the Labour Party or others. We've also looked at some mediation analysis with this model, and if we add a variable which asks people whether or not the Conservatives represent the interests of young people, this completely goes away, these effects. Whereas if you add a control variable which is the Conservative Party represents older retirees, it makes no effect, it makes no difference, right? So this is really looks to us that it's working through this idea that this government is letting down younger people, and this effect of caring, visibly caring, we think, about younger relatives who are doing badly financially disappears when you look at that representation gap that the Conservative Party has. So we have this kind of story then, which very simple, very kind of, this is all cross-sectional, it's all observational, but we think it's really consistent with the story where we're not just voting for ourselves, we're not just caring about ourselves. So the implications of just this first part, and I'm going to go on to just look at the other side of the equation. The numbers are significant, and we put out a report about this because one of the things that we always try to do is if we find something out which we think could change for the better, could have at least truth spoken into these political debates, is really, really important. And so we put out a report, we tried to kind of, summarize this for a political audience. And one of the points we made was this is a huge number of people. And it's bigger than many of the groups, the electoral groups that people are preoccupied with in the sort of analysis of British elections. So ever since 2019, political parties and journalists have been focused on an area of the country, right, or constituencies that fit into a grouping. And this is far bigger than that, but this is dispersed. And the other thing that I think is important in electoral behaviour research, I don't know, Gina, we'll talk about this later, but I feel like so much of what I'm doing, I know like what I'm doing is designing surveys and negotiating and worrying about this, that and the other. But basically, I feel like we're sort of revealing hidden parts of the electorate, that nobody kind of knew existed. And I think that's amazing, that you might think like geographically, okay, there's these constituencies and they matter. But underlying that are all these households, all these people who are worrying about stuff, who aren't represented in politics, because nobody's gone and bothered to find out anything about them, or nobody's asked questions that reveals that they exist. So I'm super excited about this. I think it's really cool. And it's sort of a consistent theme through like a lot of the stuff that I've been doing over the last few years, really. Anyway, so it's an important group. We call them family fortunes voters. I realised when I wrote this, it means nothing to anyone outside the UK of a certain age, but it was a TV programme. It was funny for us anyway, never mind. And, the thing...
How come that hasn't made it over here like every other British show? Too old? Or?
I don't know.
They don't do it in 1930s dress.
There we go.
Is that it? It was just a cheesy, like... I love that that's the first question that was asked as well. Like, well done, Taylor. Sorry, could you ask me about that coefficient over there? Or like, what is this TV show?
We want to know, do they bake?
It was like a competition show. Anyway, the key thing is that, if you're saying, so recently there was a poll that came out, and older people were, mortified about the fact that the recent budget hadn't provided a handout for pensioners, right? And, the first thing I was saying on Twitter, not that I'm talking into the void, I know at that point, right? But the first thing I'm saying, but that's not all these people care about. This is just a kind of warped way of seeing the world. It's not incorrect, but it's partial. And anyway, I'll get off my, what do they call it, my soapbox. And so, affordable housing and vocational education programs are particularly ripe if you were trying to build, if you're a political party saying, right, well, we want to do X and Y, we're not just appealing to younger voters who might not vote for you, you're also appealing to these older generations. And there's a large constituency of them. So we kind of felt it was a useful pushback. So the other question that I wanted to address briefly is this asymmetry, right? There's this kind of very significant generosity towards older generations. So can we use the same survey, can we use the same kind of concepts to look at why we might see more support for spending on older generations? And again, so here we're looking overall, right? We're not looking at those people who have younger family members struggling financially, we're looking at overall. And so one of the reasons that people give for why there's this generosity towards older people is that we're going to benefit ourselves. So there's this asymmetry, right? So older people they've already lived their lives. But you as the younger generation, essentially have a long-term self-interest that if older people are looked after, then you're going to be in that group one day. So that's one argument. The other is obviously just perceptions of deservingness and having greater needs. And this is fascinating because that data I showed you about perceptions of who was struggling financially, you know, we kind of know that the older generation, at least in the UK, is actually doing all right. And yet we still kind of feel like there's this greater set of needs, perhaps. And so we're arguing here that maybe we've kind of underestimated just how much there's this kind of demand for insurance from the state against the potential that you yourself are going to have to provide care for older family members. And this is not like some resentful care. This is just a sense that, you know, because of an aging population, you've got these additional burdens and you're going to have to look after members of the older generation yourself and your family. So to what degree can this also help us explain generosity to the old? And so we asked about like that question that I showed you earlier about practical or housing needs. There's a relatively small group who perceive that they're going to have to look after relatives aged 60 and over in the next decade. But it's not tiny, it's around 30%, and it's much higher the younger you are. And this kind of graph, I've seen this pattern so many times on so many different things. It's a really important distribution. It also predicts things like how economically insecure people feel, this kind of shape. So we've got kind of a high propensity amongst a certain group of people. And so we're interested in whether or not these kind of perceptions really are also driving political preferences. And here what we have is a model of, sorry, I should have introduced that. So we're taking that question of, you know, whether or not you perceive that you're going to have to provide care, and we're looking at support for different policies that support older people here. I'll have to read out. So this is support for increasing spending on pensions, which there's this thing called the pension triple lock, which means that the pension increases with inflation, essentially, no matter what inflation is. It's been really good for pensions in the last few years. It's the only thing, benefits don't increase with inflation. So if you're living on benefits, you're not very likely to be able to afford anything anymore because inflation has gone up. But if you're on a pension, then it's risen with inflation. It's about the only thing that has. Support for increasing spending on free elderly social care, or support for increasing spending on improving older adult mobility and activity, which we sort of think is just a nice thing. It's just a good thing. And so what we see here, no matter which model you use with the controls, you're seeing that subjective risk of having to support or needing to support an older relative, predicting your support for each of those policies again. Small effects, but nevertheless significant effects for each of those. Now we also asked, we did a little survey experiment here, and this was a framing experiment. This is one of the other nice things that you can do, especially when you're online with surveys. We've done tons and tons of these now. So we said, it is proposed that governments invest more in helping older adults in their 60s, 70s and over access social care and remain physically active and mobile at the cost of a small increase in the taxation that everyone, including yourself, currently pay. Would you support or oppose such a policy? And then we used these frames and we said this will reduce the risk that younger adults will have to shoulder the burden of looking after their parents, or this will improve the economy for everybody, happy days, or essentially this rewards people for their contributions, so this is a past reciprocity frame, or this will be a fair deal because today's younger adults will also benefit from younger taxpayer support when they get old. So we were interested in essentially as saying if the first frame was going to increase people's support for this kind of increased spending, so it will reduce the risk that young adults have to shoulder the burden of looking after their parents and grandparents. And the results suggested that frame indeed did increase support for those policies, and it was the only one. This idea that, you know, essentially what we're arguing, we're trying to frame this paper at the moment, that, you know, there's this kind of self-insurance aspect to wanting the government to step in, because obviously there's a kind of double motivation there as well, isn't there? There's the concern for the older relative, but there's also the concern for your own well-being and your own I don't want to say the burden, because it paints it in a really negative light, but, you know, there's a significant implications on you if you need to do this. I say this as somebody whose mum has messaged me ever since I've got here about her neurology appointment and all the things that are going on. I don't currently have to care for her, but somebody does, right? Like currently my dad. Anyway, so that's this. See, I'll talk about myself whenever I get the opportunity, it seems. So what are the implications? So, around 30% of people in the UK or in Great Britain, to be very precise, do face these kinds of, see that they have these kinds of considerations in the future. We've done loads of analysis to look at whether or not this is predicted by your own financial well-being, and also whether or not people who have like sort of double care responsibilities, and I think probably because of sample size we're not finding significant effects. I think there's also problems with the questions we're asking, because we don't know, we know people's perceptions of needing to do this, we don't know how much of a concern or a worry that is. So there's lots of things that we wish that we had done in this survey that we didn't do, that only with hindsight you ever get to learn about. But we know that these, care risks are associated with demand for greater spending in these areas, and there are smallish effects. They are small statistically, but they're nevertheless quite an interesting subgroup of the population. So this is my last slide. I've got no idea what the time is, so I'm really hoping that I haven't done anything terrible. My watch is a Fitbit, and it's gone on to something else now, so it doesn't tell me the time. But so, and this will sort of, this kind of I'm going to spin off this a little bit tomorrow when we talk about concepts and measurement and things. But, there's loads of things that we wish other people were doing or that we ourselves are doing. And I think, if I've learnt one thing through designing surveys, is that all of those things that I thought were just givens, when I started looking at surveys and using surveys, and that's the national economy measure, and that's the household, and then the more you think about it, the more you realise that we've got concepts in our head that aren't actually measured in surveys. And the other reason Brexit was so revelatory, is that a word? Taught me so much, was that there were suddenly so many concepts that we hadn't measured. And this is what I essentially, I could have done a totally different talk where I did the sort of greatest hits talk, which I had to give in September last year, where I was just saying, look at what, we've learned as a discipline through this, because, all of those concepts of areas and places and left behind and kind of, how people think about in-groups and out-groups, we didn't have measures of any of this before the referendum. We just suddenly thought, oh my gosh, this has been driving politics for years, and we haven't actually asked questions about it, probably because we've been thinking about individuals and households and the national economy and things like that. So we've done tons of work, and I'll talk to you through some of the examples of it tomorrow. So, what we'd really want to know is much more about the family composition, about dependents, living arrangements, and we'd love to do this in other countries. The US would be the perfect one because there are so many parallels in the economic outcomes and the economic trajectories across generations and amongst those with or without college degrees. Absolutely fascinating. I've got the most amazing graphs showing all these things in the US and the UK. Not about the family, sadly, because it doesn't exist yet. I was talking to Gary King this morning, and he wants to do a new survey, and I was like, you've got to ask about children, adult children who don't live in the house. And he was like, okay. So, one of the things that we really thought we would find is gender differences, and we haven't. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're not there. It means that we're not able to capture them with our survey. And that's a big difference, right? So is it the case that there are differences in different kinds of support that have been given, that women are doing much more of the practical support, men the more financial support? Is there a kind of risk pooling kind of aspect here? So we've just, the survey that went live today, honestly, I'm like spoilt for surveys at the moment. It's just because there's a general election coming. So we're asking now about partners' income, risk of the partner losing their job, risk of the partner's hours going down, We're doing all these tons and tons of things about trying to understand risk pooling within the household, and then we think we'll find gender differences. And then the other thing I was mentioning was that questions that we wish we'd asked, right, is just how much people are really concerned about these things, as opposed to, so much of kind of like best practice in survey design is often to try to keep away from the subjective and to try to ask actual practical objective questions. And actually, I think we've gone a little bit too far. I think we need to do both. So there's lots that we could change about this. That was just to kind of run through the final pitches that I don't think everybody's out for themselves. And I think the family is a really interesting in-group that we need to study more. Thank you.
All right, I'll come join you. I'm going to take the privilege of first couple
There
of
we go.
comments and questions. I will as soon as I can get my butt on the chair.
It's a great chair. I mean, it's,
Okay. Let me mic.
Gina was talking about like the stuff I do with ITV. I wouldn't do it on one of these chairs. I mean, like,
No.
oh, and now I'm over this side, and now
No,
I'm
in
over
fact,
this side.
most women would ban high chairs.
Right, because you have to wear trousers.
You have to wear trousers, and it does all sorts of other things. Yeah, you want to have something in front of you, but that's another question. So I'm just going to traffic cop in a moment, but I'll take a privilege of first observations and questions. One thing that seemed to me to attenuate the results you might have had is you, on the first part where you were looking at concerns about young people, you had people who had family who were struggling versus all over 60s, not people who had young people struggling versus those who weren't. So, which is fine, but you know, it seems fairly clear that if you were really doing not overlapping groups, that you might see that more. But I think the way you did it is really nice because people are used to thinking of older people, and you're saying, yeah, but if you single out this group and compare them with all older people, then you see this difference. So I don't have a religion on that. When you were talking about households and what constitutes a family, there's one other big chunk that you're aware of and that makes a total mess of measurement, and that is if you talk about the household or the family, there are the other parent people of your child that come from the split of the parents and the divorces of the parents. I mean, what is the household if you have multiple overlapping sets of adults who are in some way related to the children?
Yeah.
That's the family. Is it a household?
Right.
Well, to a degree, kind of, depending on whether the kids travel or not. And by the way, this is nothing that a survey researcher is going to get down to and define very carefully, because you'll be down to cells of 2 or 3. But that is massive, and in Britain more than in the U.S., you have a larger contingent of people with children where there are 2 parents who are involved with the child, but they're not married.
Right.
And then in both countries, you have, these multiple households. So that's, I don't know what to do with that. But it's amazing how what we used to think of as the basic demographics now are unmeasurable. We used to think it was just income that people always got wrong. So.
Oh, we still think that?
Yeah. Well, income is not measurable. It's not measurable, by the way. People are not good at saying what their income is or their household income, and that's not even counting that income isn't wealth. So those questions in surveys are all trash, basically. The sort of deeper, more interesting thing, obviously, I was reflecting on what would happen if there were the similar work done here. And Gary was one of our students, so tell him we'll take away his PhD if he doesn't do this. But the U.S. would be, I think there'd be a similar phenomenon in a way, but the measurement is super different because in the U.S., older people are struggling more. And it's largely because of our lack of a healthcare system. So in the UK, you might be worrying about a lack of sufficient support where your cognitively disabled parent or physically disabled parent can be cared for in the proper way with the proper care. And there isn't great support for that. And mom and dad or grandma and grandpa might also have health care issues where the public health service alone is not really sufficient. But here it's not sufficient in any way. And so when you put together those housing issues and everything else, in the US we actually do have more of a problem of the quality of life for elders, while at the same time right now we're, I bet if you clocked it, having a great rise in antipathy toward older people. Right? All of you have said, yeah, boomers. And there are interesting issues going on. But I think the comparison would be really interesting because the broad cultures in these ways aren't super different, but the structures of the family might be a bit different, and the public support system is quite different.
Yeah. Thank you. Would you like me to respond?
Only if something comes to mind, otherwise I'll ask these amazing people who will have better questions.
I think just to say on the new survey, thank you. The new survey, we are asking whether or not you have children who aren't in the household, like your support. Like we're looking at dependents, and we're trying, so we'll know what the cell size is of these people who live in different households but nevertheless have responsibilities. So we're going to try and do something around this because, one of the reasons income is it's just I love that you said that. But one of the reasons, so I've just got to say can I have a rant?
Yeah, sure.
So we've used income as a variable to almost define what's behind the Brexit referendum, right? These were low income, and the other problem is working class, right? So we're saying that pensioners who are working class. So we've said these working class, low income voters are driving all of our politics and our Brexit referendum and our political phenomenon. And we've done that with income, with that one measure, forgetting that pensioners just don't really have very high incomes, but they have a lot of wealth in the UK. And, forgetting that, 30% of our respondents don't answer it, or that loads of people refuse and loads of people give the wrong income. So one of the things we're trying to do now is, and this is not our innovation, it's been used by Ipsos for years, it's probably used here, I don't know if the ANAS does it now, but one of the interesting things you say, do you know best your annual income, your monthly income, your weekly income? Because the other thing is that, and most people know their monthly income, but one of the things that has transformed these kinds of questions is that if you're on a kind of a low wage, or if you're getting income from undeclared sources, or if you're on a very, very irregular income, or, you don't know your annual salary. You certainly don't know your household's annual salary, net gross, all the rest of it. Anyway, so I just love that you said that. Thank you. The healthcare point is obviously absolutely crucial here, and it's the key difference between graduates and graduates and non-graduates. I'm trying to say college, non-college, which is obviously the massive dividing line. And
Could you? I'm not looking at my. I don't do one of these. Could you tell me when we have like 10 minutes?
Absolutely.
Okay. You're on. Yes. Please introduce yourself. Say, I'm first-year student in something or other, or whatever you are.
Thank you so much, Professor. Hi, Professor Green. I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate here at Political Science, and I actually just got back from China doing fieldwork on the very similar topic.
Oh, cool.
Studying family dynamics and gender dynamics after the country's ending its one-child policy.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I just got really excited during your talk. So I have 3 questions. So the first one is, I'm wondering, I'm really fascinated also by these family dynamics and gender dynamics that you discussed, and in a UK context, how they influence political choice. But it prompted me to think about how these dynamics could play out in a non-democratic setting. I guess I'll be also thinking about this question in my own time. And then the second question is, you mentioned that actually didn't do any surveys. I only did qualitative interviews, but I was really fascinated by how you said that your survey enabled you to reach some population that you wouldn't otherwise have talked to. So I was just wondering, like, how you managed to reach them, and how come, like, how come you reach those population but not others? And if you have other population in mind, would your strategy be any different?
Mm-hmm.
And my third question is on sensitive questions. So as I understand, and talking to some of my informants in China, domestic violence is a hugely sensitive topic there, and if a woman experiences something, don't even like report them to the authority. So I was just wondering if you thought about how to deal with these sensitive questions in your surveys. Thank you so much.
No, thank you very much. I'd love to hear more about what you found. You're right. You're right to ask. I mean, so we're talking about a context where you can vote against the incumbent, right? That you feel like you have the available choice to do that. So I think it's really an interesting comparison, and it's one I'd need to think about a bit more, I think, and know more about the Chinese context to know, what do you do? I mean, I suppose there's maybe a slight parallel for people that see absolutely nothing's ever going to change, which, is also a theme of our politics, right? Where even in a democratic setting, the sense that nobody's ever going to resolve anything, that nothing's ever going to get better, this is the status quo and you're sort of stuck with it, is actually quite a prevalent attitude. But it's, so that's a really interesting question. In terms of reaching the population, so I think I might have not phrased that very well, I think. So what we're doing here is a kind of a representative survey, a representative sample of the UK population. So it's weighted data using this opt-in YouGov panel, but it's essentially a cross-section of the UK population, as much as we're able to achieve that with a survey that's online. What I really mean by reaching a population is that if we don't ask questions, so if we ask about individuals and households and the national economy, and we ask all the set number of questions, and we never find out that there are people that have kids and those kids are really not able to get on the housing ladder, or they haven't gone to university and people are very worried about them, we'll just never see them. We'll just never know that those concerns are there. And so when we kind of estimated the proportions of people in our sample, what we're saying there is that there's a set of people with a certain kind of experience. And it's that experience that we're able to illuminate and describe and look at the consequences of within that population. So there's a thing I'll talk about tomorrow where we looked at young males who perceive discrimination against men. And the out-of-work males. We wouldn't know about those things if we hadn't asked those perception questions. I mean, it's like any survey, right? What you're trying to do is, but I think the reason this tells us about not new populations as in groups, but new types of concerns and worries is just we're asking different questions. The sensitivity thing is really, really a good question, and we're not asking anything here that we think is sensitive, but we are avoiding things that we think are sensitive. And we're avoiding them because we feel we have to. And I think for this particular topic, I guess, if you were starting to ask about, perhaps questions about, within the household, do you feel that your partner is reliable or supportive? Maybe people wouldn't be too truthful about that. Whether you asked people about the likelihood of your elderly relatives passing away, that would also feel like we'd stepped over a line. There are lots of questions that we don't ask, and we probably should find ways as social scientists to find out more about. But surveys are a really difficult method for doing that.
If I can jump in on that. Political science won't give you much of an answer, but But look at the survey methodology and interview methodology in sociology, social work, and clinical psychology, because they do a tremendous amount of work on domestic violence, on drug behavior, and all sorts of other things where you can't just walk in and say, does your partner beat you, or
Right.
you know, when was the last time you used an illegal drug? And so they will have the kind of in-depth methodology of how do you approach those kinds of questions, for example, in the United States, especially in subpopulations, where it would be even more difficult to approach those questions.
So my students in survey research methods, our last topic was sensitive questions.
Okay.
Nice.
And for this week, they wrote up some sensitive questions using techniques that we learned. So we've had a little bit of experience playing around with that. And
Okay.
Steve took that course a couple weeks ago, so it's been a while. But several of the folks here did this in the past week. So.
Okay. I'll ask
Healthcare
more.
system is capturing some of those questions now. Maybe this is just my personal experience, but it seems like now every time I enter the healthcare system for one reason or another, I'm getting asked if I feel safe in the home that I'm.
Yes.
I wonder if somehow that could be disaggregated and depersonalized in a way that could be useful.
Yeah.
Ecological. Yes, please introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Professor Green, lovely to meet you. My name is Brendan Sullivan. I'm a first year here in the PhD program. I'm really fascinated by the sort of rethinking of the concept of the household. My personal interests, I study the political economy of markets and states in particular, so the relationship between them and emerging tech. But really thinking of the household as a very important sort of intermediate or sort of, intermediate variable, I'm sort of looking at, especially from the UK context, looking at sort of, for instance, like generational status in the UK. And I say that to sort of proxy, those who would have come to the UK from, say, I'm from Jamaica, so I'm thinking about like those who are like, first generation British, second generation British, and the kind of familial sort of like approach that people who would have come from these contexts
Right.
would have had, and
Yeah.
how that could affect,
Right.
for instance, support for, older
Yes.
care, and how
Yes.
those subgroups sort of navigate that kind of
Yes.
decision and policy preferences more generally.
Yeah. Oh, so fascinating. I mean, one of the things that we say in the paper is like, we were kind of contrasting Italy and, kind of national cultural differences in caregiving to elders, sharing the home with elders, taking responsibility. I mean, the UK, in a sense, we kind of feel is on the more hard-hearted end of this spectrum on the aggregate and the national level. And we wondered, precisely because we were doing this survey in a quite toxic kind of post-Brexity, age divides, culture wars kind of context, whether that would have exacerbated some of these things. So we'd kind of thought about, that of course there will be cultural differences, right? I think, again, coming back to the problems of surveys, there are parts of the UK now and there are cities in the UK where there are 40 or more % who are not white British, right? And that's where we're not going to do a very good job on a national survey, where, the proportion of white British in our sample is about 90%. So we don't have the ability to drill down and look at differences within different ethnic minority groupings with this data at all. But you're absolutely right to say that those kind of cultural differences and norms of reciprocity, norms of care, norms of, living within and without. And of course, this was hugely brought into focus during the pandemic, where so many people were sharing large households within cities and were obviously getting very sick.
Is this a sample matched, like a internet panel that's matched to a sample from a probability sample, or is it just like a quota sample?
It's a quota sample.
Okay. So,
yeah.
So it does poorly on those things.
Yeah, and it's also only in English,
Yeah.
right? So if you want to, if you want to do a very high quality survey in the UK, and you want to do different languages, and you want to make sure that, you know, all of your advanced letters and everything else is all correctly sent out, and if you want to have interviewers who are also, you know, who speak different languages, that is very expensive. And our funding body has refused to fund this for the last kind of 2 rounds. It's cost loads more than the British election study, the whole of the British election study, to do this well. So yeah, it's a real frustration for social scientists in the UK. It was just recently knocked back, the whole ethnic minority. There was an ethnic minority British election study, MBES, that ran alongside the British election study in 2 occasions, and we haven't been able to get it funded. Not we, colleagues.
I have no idea where the ANAS is now. Back when I was directing it, we lost all funding briefly, and I had to somehow get it all clawed back. This was in the late 1990s. But we were beginning to do these things. We were still face-to-face for the nationals.
Yeah.
And we were starting to do multiple languages and all of that, but it is enormously expensive, and very often the funding bodies are just, they're just not interested, you know, and this is, I'll do a rant, and this is because they see public opinion polling done every week, all week, by so many different people. And if they can do it, why can't you do it?
Yeah.
And of course they don't.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we could rant for a while, huh?
We'll do it at dinner. After Taylor.
This is why the next frontier should be surveys in the global south that you can still afford to do face-to-face surveys.
Yes.
We'll talk about that at dinner.
Okay, we'll do that at dinner too.
So your reference. So Gina mentioned the United States as a sort of a, you know, thinking about how effects might be different here, and you mentioned Italy, and I was wondering as you were presenting this, are these findings dependent on the context of a liberal welfare state, right? Would this not work in Sweden because there's just sort of, you know, much more solidarity across age groups outside of the family?
Yeah. Yeah, great question. I mean, so yeah, why do you have to insure yourself? Why do you want the state to step in at all? Because the state's not doing it. Yeah. So why would you have preferences for more spending on anything across the board? And why would you be concerned for different groups in society if those, you know, it's because we're failing these different groups, right? This is precisely why people want the state to step in and insure themselves against these kinds of concerns and worries. So absolutely, I think this is absolutely context dependent.
I'd love to see these sorts of questions on you know, cross-national representative sample surveys, and you could do that analysis, right? Sort of show how the heterogeneous treatment effects by, you know, some are heterogeneous effect of family relationships by some measure of strength of the welfare state.
Right. Yeah.
Sounds like CSES.
Yeah, I just wrote down CS.
Do they have this question?
No.
Yeah.
No. I mean, the other big bugbear is measurements of economics. I mean, I could, maybe we'll do call it the new thing, a new CSCS that's really drill down.
What we're talking about is a coordination among national election studies that began in the 1990s.
Sorry, I should have said that.
No, it's fine. And it's one of the real privileges I had, because they were just finishing the first module when I came in as director, and we were the home of this, and it is still, I'm glad to see it still
Michigan's
happening.
still running their CSCS, right? Dave Howell.
So what it does is you try to coordinate among all the national election studies, which is a huge number, to come up with a core of a set of questions that you promise each other you're going to ask in the same way, and do lots of translation back and forth to try to get it done in the right way. So all of the usual problems you have coordinating cross-nationally is utterly amazing. And it's a wonderful idea, but it tends to be fairly conservative in the way it...
Yeah, it's not long for that reason. I mean, we just say yes and we just put it in.
Yeah.
So that's the you know, so somebody else worries about the content, a big board worry about the content, and we just go, yep. Okay, that's what we're doing.
Yeah.
So we do a face-to-face survey, which this is the other survey that we're just finishing right now. So we've just piloted our post-election face-to-face, just in case there was an election in May.
It'd be easier to put, this takes you out of the, advanced democracy, advanced welfare state context, but like in, America's Barometer, for example, right? Yeah, that's
They're part of it.
Oh, wow, no, I'm not part of it personally.
No, they are.
Oh, they are.
CSES from the very beginning, the Latino Barometer, the Afro Barometer, I mean,
Yeah,
the
well, the
most of
Latino
them-
Barometer is a different organization.
It
than
is,
America's
yeah,
Barometer,
yeah.
But these sorts of projects where you have a single organization that's running the whole thing, right? I mean, they can make a decision right there, and all of a sudden you have a question on a questionnaire in 30 countries, right?
Right.
So, yeah.
More questions? Yes, please.
Thank you for your talk. I'm second year, I'm Estelle Brun, second year PhD in political science, and I study the EU identity generally, so I don't study the
EU identity.
anymore. Yes.
Uh-huh.
And I just thank you for laughing. It's hard for a second. I have two questions. One, I guess, is echoing Taylor's question about the extent to which this is contextual to right now, and when I think about France and about this, what we call it the sandwich generation.
Yeah, we
you know,
call
like
that, yeah.
that's exactly what you're describing. And whether that's going to be relevant in 10 or 15 years, like what is the external validity, I guess. And my second question, and I just Googled the term from French to English, and it doesn't really exist, but I was wondering if you considered the role of class in the family unit, but especially what showed up was class defectors. But I'm not really sure that's what I mean, but whenever you have two generations within the same family, but they've switched classes. And so what would be the impact of that, if that's relevant? Because that's really a hot topic in France right now, and I feel it's very similar.
Like mobility, like you go from working class to middle class or something like that?
Yes, but yes, I guess class mobility would be the less leftist term, but it has a slightly different connotation.
There you go.
Involuntary.
No, much
Trade
more.
would be like
voluntary.
class
Because I've
trader,
heard
and I
class
think,
trader when it's voluntary, like somebody who rejects the bourgeois values of their parents kind of thing, that's a class trader. But I think we're seeing people, a downward mobility.
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
don't know what the word for that is.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that the context is also when thinking about the main lovely assumption that your family members want what is best for you, and I think it's particularly interesting when you think about class differences within a family.
Yeah.
Then maybe they don't. The class interest.
Oh, okay, so we're in a Marxist kind of...
A Marxist website showed up when I typed. It's not Marxist.
Okay. Oh, so I think it is really context dependent. So I think it's really nationally context dependent, and I think it's really now context dependent. But I think that's a positive, right? Because I think what we've missed is how to respond to demographic change and the policy context that changes, right? So for me, that's kind of like hey, the context has changed. Like, what about this context? And in a context of very stark intergenerational inequality and an aging population, how do we do social surveys? How do we do political science? Does this stuff matter? Do people recognize it? So one of our starting points was, do people really, I showed you that people sort of recognize this. We asked loads of questions about like what people think is the average home ownership rates of different groups, because we were thinking, do people really see this? Because, you'd expect, because of, Gina says something about boomers, and like kind of antipathy towards older people, we were sort of worried that all of these sort of stereotypes were clouding people's awareness of this context. And actually, no, it's really people are very aware of what the context is. So I think the context is really crucial, and I think it will be different in 10 years' time. I don't know how it will be different in 10 years' time. So what we're seeing in the UK is essentially no provision whatsoever for the long-term funding of social care. All politicians ducking this over and over and over. Younger generations not, getting into huge amounts of debt, not being able to buy houses, and then having to bail out older generation. So I don't think it's going to get any easier, but that's a little bit gloomy. Your question about class is super hard because I'm not quite sure. I think you're getting at something that I'm not going to completely get, but you can tell me about it later or tonight or tomorrow or whenever we see each other. But I think, but the problem is, so what we've got is what we've really got is a devaluation of everyone's expectations with age, right? So if we thought that, social mobility was just a norm, that you just did better than your parents. I mean, this is the big thing that's changed, that now you've not got the expectation that you're going to do better than your parents. And your parents can see that. So we also wondered if there was a kind of a guilt element that parents, or grandparents could see that they'd benefited from cheap houses and all the rest of it. I'm not sure that that's really going to be what you pick up, actually. Because there's a sort of, well, we've earned this, and, we don't really want to admit to being the lucky generation. But anyway, so that's one of the key things, is you have got downward mobility now being a very significant problem. Very significant problem. Now, the thing with class, I'll just say one thing is, and this is, sorry, Gina and I feel like I've met my soulmate in social survey world.
There's a bond among us all.
We're just going to agree on a lot of stuff, I think. But one of the interesting things about social class, right, is I don't know that younger generations see the world in the same way. So we do as social scientists, we think about class. But could how many young people will say that, what does it mean to be working class now? Whereas when working class was an identity, when working class was a pride, when there were working class jobs that you could define as working class jobs, you can imagine people wanting to say they're working class, right? And this has been a huge thing in British politics. It's driven our politics for decades. But what do you say if you're an Uber driver or you're a Deliveroo person or you work in a cafe and you're a barista and do you say you're working class? I don't think you would, right? Because you don't have that same blue collar kind of working in industry. I don't know. And so we've just piloted, as I was saying, the survey, and it was one of the feedbacks we got. We asked a question about subjective class. And so we do occupational class coding, but we also say, do you see yourself as working class or middle class? And the younger respondents couldn't answer it. They were like, what does this mean? I don't know what it means to be working. What is this working class? Yeah.
They haven't.
Yeah, but so has the Labour Party, right? So the Labour Party stopped talking about class, stopped competing on class. I think there's a whole measurement problem across generations with what it means to be part of these groups.
And actually in the US, that question has been a mess in most of the post-World War II period for a couple of reasons. One is what we found in the 60s, 70s is most Americans thought they were middle class. Mm-hmm. They were quite sure of it. And the other thing is that because in the US for a long time, class and race has been so much more important in the US than it was in Britain until recently. And so that really mangled the notion of class. Mm. Because what does it mean when race drives status so much, ability? Education doesn't work the same way for white people and black people, and so we were finding that subjective social class was really very slippery and mushy and didn't mean a whole lot. And so it's interesting that, again, context matters.
Context is everything.
I think we may have time for one more, but then we're getting together later. So is there another question? I see a hand almost coming up. I see you.
Hello, yes. Okay. Presentation. I'm an exchange student. I'm from Italy, actually. And I'm studying political science. And, about the question for, why would they support any form of help to older people? We saw that it was more of an individualistic answer, right? So there was no answer in terms of principles of justice. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I wonder, how do we could we justify that? Like, do we think of, again, something like cultural, like context specific to England, but I don't think so. Well, in general, like, in terms of like principles of justice, maybe something lacking everywhere. So is it a cultural thing, or is it like lack of knowledge of like,
Yeah.
I don't know, like justice education, like knowing, or like having like a sense of consciousness with respect to that, or are we assuming that, are we actually really individuals? I don't know. I just wanted to know if there was some thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I kind of framed this whole session as we're not all greedy, and then I showed you a graph saying the only thing that works in the framing is like you're going to have to worry about this yourself. I'm kind of just tempted to undermine the evidence just a little bit, or just to put some caution around it, right? That this is a small effect. It's a one-off survey framing experiment. You know, I'm not going to take away from that the British are self-interested. You know, so just to I just wanted to soften, I think, how much of a conclusion I'll take from one framing experiment. These are interesting experiments, especially when you line them up with a series of different evidence that sort of tells the same story. It gives you a little bit more confidence, but I don't think we could put too much on this. So what I'm trying to say is I don't think all of the other frames wouldn't work in some circumstances for some people.
I also was thinking maybe also the nudge of seeing the other answers, like with respect to seeing the possibility of having the greedy option, maybe like...
Yeah, sorry, I should have said these are randomized, right? So you only see one.
They're not
Yeah.
Okay, so I think I didn't go...
I'm sorry, I should have explained that. So in the experiment, you're in a control group, you don't see anything, or you get one of those different treatments. Yeah, so the only treatment group that... Yeah, but I don't look at that and think, oh, there isn't some reciprocity, or there isn't some general kind of sense of concern for the old, because that just runs against everything else that we see, right? We see huge amounts of support for spending on the old. We see huge support, you know. So I don't think that that's right. I think that particular nudge worked. Yeah. I just wouldn't hang too much on that, I think. So I know what you're meant to say is, well, my results show blah, 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 blah. But, you know, this is the other thing that happens to you when you work in surveys, right? Like you start becoming very, very sanguine about, how much you can infer about human behavior from just a tick, 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 tick on a screen, you know. You can learn a lot, but there's obviously a lot of limitations.
You don't have the benefit of the theoretical rat choice people. I didn't say that. So thank you so much. It's very clear. I drew a lot of questions, and I'm sure you'll have more. And the workshop, I think, will be well worth going to and having more conversation with Jane. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's all go get some sustenance after we applaud.